Hey everyone, this is Arif. I just have a quick ask before we get into the show today. If you could just please subscribe to the podcast and whatever player you're listening to this on and leave us a 5-star rating and review. That does the absolute most to get our name out there and help people find us. If you're looking for any other way to support the show, you can head over to thelifeofxpodcast.com and click on our support page. All right, thank you. Enjoy the show. Hello, and welcome to the podcast. My name is Arif Jadala.
And I'm Melvin Barnes.
And this is the Life of X podcast. So it's been a while since we've recorded. A lot of new stuff going on. Melvin, what's new with you?
So I am a newly minted doctoral candidate at the Ohio State University. It was a pretty long and horrible journey, to be 100% honest, but I'm glad to be over it.
Just awful. What else? It's been like since September, since the last time we did this.
Oh, man.
We ran a marathon.
Yeah, we ran a marathon.
We both did run a marathon. One of us trained for it. The other one did not.
Yes, that's very true. I did not train for the marathon.
And I did. And we both finished. Melvin didn't die, so I lost a bet.
Yeah, and I would like to point out that I almost caught him at one point, and there was only about 20 minutes between our finish times.
Yeah. I'd also like to point out that Melvin abandoned his friend that he was supposed to be running it with.
I was racing against him.
Yeah, you're a bad person.
Well, whatever. Kenyan blood.
I don't think that's true at all.
Probably not,
Wow.
but I like to imagine.
All right. So, who we got today?
Today we have Dwight Eisenhower.
Controversial figure.
Is he all that controversial?
I don't know. I feel like a lot of people just view him as a real hero. And I'm not trying to disparage his name too much, but he's definitely a controversial guy in my mind with some of his decisions, some of his actions.
Okay. All right. Well, you know what? We're going to get into all that.
Yeah. I don't know. Start us off.
All right. So to start off our discussion of Dwight Eisenhower, I'm going to give you guys a little background on his family. So Dwight is the son of David Eisenhower and Ida Eisenhower. Basically,
Father of the Year.
Father of the Year. David was not exactly
A good person.
a good father. We'll put it that way.
Or husband. Or businessman. Or son.
Mostly just not good at anything.
Nah, he was just a bad person, pretty much.
Yes.
Maybe not morally corrupt, but like not a good person.
Maybe a little morally corrupt. Let's get into it. So David is the son of, what's his father's name?
Jacob.
Jacob Eisenhower, who is actually a fairly successful businessman.
Oh, really successful.
Yeah, well, yeah, not even fairly, extremely successful. I mean, I believe were they out in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, leader of the River Brethren. They are Mennonites. They're offshoots of the Mennonites in Pennsylvania.
And while living in Pennsylvania, they actually collected a good bit of land, which ultimately they end up selling and turning a fairly good profit from all of this. So David Eisenhower actually comes from money.
Yeah, and they got even more wealthy when they moved the River Brethren to Kansas, and they were just selling off land super cheap. So they bought up a bunch of it, and Jacob bought a ton of land, and
Get involved with the creamery?
yeah, bought a creamery, built a windmill, which I don't know how successful a windmill was at the time, but I think that's really neat.
Now, I would like to ask you, what exactly do we do at creameries? Do we just produce cream?
I think they just produce dairy products. I don't know.
Well, David's father, as we've pointed out, very successful and has a successful family business, which kind of makes David's kind of performance a little more strange.
Yeah.
Because he drove his family into poverty.
Yeah, well, the crazy thing about it is that when Jacob and the River Brethren moved, he set aside money for all of his sons, like when they got married.
A lot of money.
Yeah, like a lot of money in today's money. He more or less set them all up for success. And David was just kind of like, oh, success. Not interested.
Yeah. So what David ends up doing is he opens up his own, was it just a family grocery store?
Well, first he went to Lane College because he didn't want to be a farmer. He wanted to be an engineer, which, perfectly great profession. And that's where he met Ida. That's where he met Dwight's mom, was at Lane. And neither of them decided they were going to finish. Whatever. You don't need to finish, especially when you got rich parents who are willing to hand off a slice of the business to you.
Kanye.
Right. But David was just like not interested in being part of the business. So he goes and he starts a general store with Jacob's backing.
Starts a general store with, was it initially his? No, it wasn't initially his brother, with a guy named Milton Good.
Milton Good, that devil. That
As
can't say those words on the podcast.
As family lore would have it, this guy is the reason why the general store kind of goes under. The story is that they were, working to build up the store together, and Milton, through his kind of backhanded deals and treachery, ends up stealing the family's money and running off, which I think, according to our historian, is not actually the case.
Not actually the case at all. What actually happened was that Milton just didn't like to work with David Eisenhower, who was just generally
a bad businessman.
A bad business person, and from all accounts, not easy to get along with. So we're talking about Milton Good and the family myth and how they blamed him as a thief who stole their money and ran. It's absolutely not true at all. The family myth ends with poor David, destitute, having to travel to Denison, Texas to find work and bring his family along later. That's not at all what happened. What actually happened was that he and Milton didn't get along, surprise, surprise, and they agree mutually to dissolve the business by David buying out Milton with money that he borrowed from Jacob, his father, and using the store's inventory as collateral. Jacob, realizing that his son was a dud, converts the loan into a gift and installs his older brother, which name of the year, Abraham Lincoln Eisenhower, to be a partner with David and help him run the business. David, again, impossible to work with, decided he didn't like working with his brother.
So what does he do?
The responsible thing that all good husbands and fathers would do. He leaves his pregnant wife and just drifts to Denison, Texas.
Got to get out of town.
No skills to speak of. Nothing. So ends up as an engine wiper working on a railroad, which I'll be completely honest with you, I am not 100% sure what that is.
I don't know what you do.
It sounded like he was just like wiping grease off of these,
like coal dust.
Yeah. And so they're living in this shack.
When the family eventually shows up, because eventually he gets his act together and brings his family down to Denison, and they're living in absolute squalor.
Yep. So they're living in squalor.
Absolute squalor, which we really do have to kind of juxtapose this with the fact that his family has money.
And was willing to set him up and give him a great start. I forget what it was. I have it in the article, but it's something like the equivalent of $50,000 or something like that they were more or less, that they were gifted and land to begin this farm and stuff on. And he just decided he would rather be a bum.
Yeah, like not even just money. Money and a means to produce more money.
Yep. Dude was literally set up for success and just threw it back in his father's face.
Not interested.
No. So what ends up happening while they're living in Denison is that eventually Jacob's wife passes away, and he goes to visit his son, who he hasn't seen in a while, and is mortified by the conditions that his son, his daughter-in-law, and his grandchildren are living in. And he's really well connected in the town that they were from, in Kansas, Abilene. And he gets David a job at the creamery that he owned in Abilene that really wasn't paying any more, but at least now he could keep an eye on them.
Yeah, have the family close where he can, make sure the kids are eating and maybe having a decent change of clothes.
And at first when they get there, they are just living in a little apartment that is still a gigantic step up from what they were living in Texas, which, by the way, I don't think we mentioned that, but that's where Ike was born, was in Denison. He was born while they were living there.
Rough.
Yeah, the only one of the kids who was a Texan by birth. But eventually what ends up happening is that Abraham Lincoln Eisenhower moves away and gifts them his house. And it was in reality a gift because, again, it was a loan that was covered by Jacob that was converted into a gift. So it was more or less them just giving them this beautiful home.
Cashing in on the hard work of others.
Yeah, cashing in. All right, so we've established that David had just been given a beautiful house where he is in Abilene under the watchful, benevolent eye of his father. if you haven't already figured out the fact that David is kind of a different dude and like a dud of a father, let me just go ahead and say that he was. An important part of their being David and Ida, their philosophy of parenting was religion. They were both Christians in
Different senses.
some sort of way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Ida was much more of a straight arrow. I mean, she was a Jehovah's Witness, but David was into something that I think it's something that's hard to explain. He believed in this kind of mix of kind of Christianity and mysticism.
Yeah, it was like centered around the Pyramid of Giza.
Yeah, some really out there stuff.
There's still some stuff like that out there, though. Like,
ancient aliens.
Well, there's ancient aliens, and then it's still centered around the Pyramid of Giza. Like there's the one entrance that's never been opened, and there are people out there who think that if you open it, they're gonna find some alien stuff or something. So maybe David started that.
Yeah, I don't know. Either way, some weird stuff. But these were some faith-filled people, and I think that was a central pillar of Ida's kind of parenting philosophy. And what we really see between these two individuals is that as bad of a father as David was, Ida was just that good of a mother.
She was the complete opposite. And Gene Edward Smith, whose biography we're basing most of this episode off of, he really points out the complete opposite nature of these two, from their parenting philosophies to just their general personalities in general, where Ida was a very happy, positive person. David was always brooding and angry. And as a parent, Ida was always there to support the kids and to encourage them, and to, when they had scratched up knees or elbows, she was always there to make them feel better. Whereas David more or less pretended his kids didn't exist, and every once in a while would just acknowledge them with angry outbursts.
Yeah, he was supposed to be quite the stern disciplinarian, right?
Yeah. But the one thing that David really gave to his children was an excellent example of exactly what not to be.
The gift that keeps on giving.
Right. And all of his children learned well from that. The Eisenhower clan, there were how many boys?
Ooh, I don't know how many boys, but 7 kids total, right?
Yeah, and they were all boys. So all 7 boys wanted out of Abilene and as far away from David as they could, as soon as they could, with the exception of Ike.
Ike, who kind of hung around for a little while and actually started working at the creamery, the same one that his father, by this point in time, is still working at.
In the same position that he'd had.
Yeah, and eventually Ike starts making more money than his dad was making.
Yeah, he becomes the night shift superintendent, and within, I think it was only like 2 years. And so it just speaks to David's work ethic.
Yeah, and that must have been a weird family dynamic where it's like, okay, your son is in a senior position kind of over you, and you've been there for, by this point in time, probably close to 20 years.
Yeah. So, now we have a young Ike who was very intelligent, although not necessarily the most motivated student through high school. He had always had like a deep love of history. And I believe in his yearbook, he was voted most likely to become a Yale professor of history, which is super specific.
Who has that in their yearbook?
I guess he did.
Wow.
He was a pretty decent athlete as well. Loved baseball and football. And there's actually a myth that I don't know, it could be true or
he ran a 4.40.
Huh?
He ran a 4.40.
No, he may have. More power to him. But there's a legend anyway that Ike had actually, between high school and West Point, he had played semi-professional baseball, which I actually heard for the first time on Mike Rowe's podcast, The Way I Heard It. He has a very interesting episode, which, could have really changed the fate of the United States if it were true, because if that were the case, then he would have been eligible to go to West Point, which kicked off his military career.
Ineligible?
Yeah. I guess at the time, the way I understand it anyway, is that at the time, if you had done any sort of like professional sports or something like that for whatever reason, it would have made him eligible for West Point.
Could he have gone to any of the other military academies?
I'm not sure.
Interesting.
Yeah, but I mean, again, I would direct any of our listeners to that episode of The Way I Heard It by Mike Rowe. But he definitely gives the impression that had Ike been found out, because when he allegedly played semi-pro, he was under an assumed name. And if he had been found out, he would have not been able to go to West Point and potentially any of the other military academies.
Wild. So let's talk about how he actually ends up at West Point.
Okay, so he's at the creamery, outworking his dad. Already a young man, just embarrassing his father. And he reconnects with a friend from high school, Everett Swede Hazlitt, who was the son of a wealthy Abilene physician.
Great name.
Yeah, it really is. And he had gone off. He had left Abilene to go to some prep school, and he was studying for the entrance exam to the Naval Academy. And Ike, bright guy, wasn't super interested in sticking around Abilene, and so Swede was like, "Hey, you should definitely do this.
Best
Military."
way out, military.
Right. And the issue was at the time, in order to get to one of these military academies, and I'm pretty sure it's still the same way, that you need a senatorial appointment or a congressional
couple
appointment.
Of letters of reference.
Yeah. And at the time, it was not merit-based.
Yeah, I mean, the sense that we got was that it was kind of, you had to have, your family had to have a certain status.
Yeah, you had to have connections.
Right. And it just so happened that this senator in Ike's home state took a different approach to this.
Yeah, he was Senator Bristow. I don't know how you would say that, but he was a fierce enemy of the spoil system. He believed that you should earn what you get.
Right. So this guy, Ike gets in touch with him and asks to have this letter of reference written for him. And this guy,
he was like, "Hey, we got these competitive exams coming up. Come and sit for them."
Yeah, let's see how you do. And if you do well enough, maybe I'll write this letter for you.
Yeah. So Ike goes in, does really well. Oddly enough, though, he lies on his application to West Point and to the Naval Academy about how old he was, because he was too old to go to the Naval Academy, but not too old to go to West Point. He does really well on his entrance exams, ends up getting admitted, and still, when asked to confirm his age, just continued to lie about how old he was. So Ike's official age through the military was always 18 months younger than he actually is.
Really, that's wild. So, I mean, on this point, too, we can also touch a little bit on how West Point was different from other schools at the time.
Yeah. So, I mean, even today, less so. The way I understand it, for those of you who don't know, Melvin and I were both, Melvin still is a graduate student at Ohio State, and I was, and we got to meet and have some relationships with some people who came out of West Point and who were doing their graduate work at OSU to return to teach at West Point. And the way they talk about it is that West Point is a great school to learn at and still centered around engineering. But at the time, at Ike's time, it was definitely very centered around engineering. There, you went to West Point to get an understanding of how war worked and how the military worked, and to learn to be an engineer. And at the time, they were really stuck in the past.
Yeah, in terms of education, it was a pretty conservative approach to teaching all of this stuff at West Point. So, I mean, I think that most of their classes, they're still looking at military maneuvers from the Civil War rather than...
And this is during World War I.
Exactly.
We've got the machine gun, we've got trench warfare. You know what I mean? There are...
incredible advances in
military technology. Yeah, I mean, the age of modern warfare is upon them. And they're still teaching, line your troops up and go to battle.
Yeah.
And my favorite excerpt from this part of the book from Smith was a quote from the superintendent of West Point, Hugh Scott, when addressing the idea that West Point needed to evolve its pedagogical approaches, because again, they weren't about fostering critical thinking. They were about
memorization, basically.
Rote memorization of not only battle tactics and that sort of thing, but you better know the name of every officer who was on the field in each battle,
and which road he brought up his troops.
Right. So really things that would appear very archaic today. But addressing this point, Hugh Scott says, West Point is not subject for reform. It goes forward on its majestic course from year to year toward the fulfillment of its destiny, moving serenely under its tradition of honor, duty, and country, without need of radical alteration, or alteration at all.
I right when I hear majestic course, I'm like, okay, let's tune out here.
Love it.
But listen, the world will adjust to West Point.
Exactly.
West Point doesn't adjust to the world.
Exactly. If it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Right. But, I mean, admittedly, the war itself did ultimately have an effect on how West Point taught military tactics.
So we talked about the way that Ike was being educated at West Point. What we haven't talked about was the man himself at West Point.
The man, the myth, the legend.
The man, the myth, the legend. He continued his high school ways of being a very intelligent and capable student, but not applying himself super hard. He was 2 years older. He was 20 when he entered West Point. And so that made him 2 years older than the average student. So he was 2 years more mature physically as well. He excelled in sports and that sort of thing too. But he just kind of didn't do well with authority early on.
And I think the teaching style kind of put him off too.
Yeah, I'm sure that was it too, but he just racked up demerits. And he loved to smoke and he loved to gamble. And both of those things were not allowed at West Point, so he just had an alarming number of demerits while there.
Right. But, at least on the football field, he was a fairly decent athlete. I'm not saying he ran a 4.28, but, he did well.
But, he was going to be the first Bo Jackson is what you're really trying to say.
Yes. But, and this is a big but, he ends up blowing out his knee.
The greatest that never was.
And this isn't, the mid to late aughties where, we can repair Adrian Peterson's knee and he comes back better, like 2 weeks later.
We just give him a bionic leg.
Right. So basically this knee injury ends his career and actually has the potential to end, his potential to become a military officer. But
this also was sort of a blessing in disguise because it started his coaching career.
That's true.
After he tore up his knee, he ended up being a coach for the junior varsity team at West Point, which would serve as a hobby that actually paid him pretty well throughout his military career, too.
Yeah, we'll definitely touch on his coaching success later. So, as it comes close to time for him to actually leave West Point and enter the military, his chances of actually becoming a commissioned officer it's not very good because he has this...
Because he's hurt, and Wilson is trying to keep military costs down. And putting an already, previously injured soldier out onto the field means they're probably going to have to pay him after they medically decommission him when he gets hurt again.
But
Fortuna!
Chief Medical Officer Alden Shaw takes a liking to Ike and really tries to push him through so that he can become a commissioned officer. And a matter of fact, he takes this all the way up to the War Department Surgeon General to get Ike to remain in the military.
Which is wild because like Ike didn't even care that much.
Yeah, he was like, you know what? If I'm not going to be in the military, I'll just go to Argentina and be a cowboy.
He really was just going to go be a cowboy.
Argentina. It sounds like I'm making this up, but I'm not. He had a thing.
Yeah, he had visions of the Old West where he could, but he was like, in Argentina, it's still like that. I'm going to go down there. I'm going to go shoot these pistols off.
Put a couple guns on my hip.
Right.
Roll down to Argentina, herd some cattle, and shoot bad guys.
Yeah.
So
the dream.
Right. But Alden Shaw sees something in him. Now, can you imagine, years later, if you're Alden Shaw, yes, I'm the one that kept Ike in the military. That. Crazy, wild. Basically, the greatest. Maybe he was like a mystic or something like
Maybe
that.
he was.
Yeah. Who knows? But long story short.
Probably some Pyramid of Giza stuff with him.
Long story short, he is commissioned after graduating from West Point and enters the military.
Yeah, and he graduated with the class of 1915. I think it's interesting.
Finest class.
Yeah, it was a cool. They have a cool name for that class. It was the class that the stars fell on because of the 115 men from Ike's class that were still active through World War II, 60 became general officers, with Ike and his close friend Omar Bradley becoming 5-star generals. There were also 2 full generals, 7 lieutenant generals, 24 major generals, and 25 brigadier generals, all from the same class at West Point.
Basically the most ballin' class you'll ever
hear about. I mean, pretty much.
So Ike's first assignment was at Fort Sam Houston. Now, when Ike gets there, he's basically encouraged to coach the football team.
At a local prep school.
Yeah. And Ike, being the serious military man that he was at this time, decided, I don't want to do that.
I don't have time for that.
I'm going to focus on what's going on here at the base.
Right.
Well, long story short, the commander of the base says, no. You weren't, exactly brought here to not coach this team.
Right.
We know what you did at West Point. We know you were a great coach. You're going to coach the team.
Yeah, he was approached in the officers club by the head of the fort and was like, hey, my friend who offered you that job, you're going to take it.
Right. And it's I think one thing that's interesting is he's like, you're not doing a whole lot. I know you think you're really busy, but you've got time to do this.
You will make time to do this.
Right. So basically he shows up and he is, a coach, a football coach.
Yeah, and that's something that he continued to do wherever he got stationed. Local prep schools wanted him because he was apparently a pretty good coach.
Yeah, he made some great football players. But what probably was the most important thing to happen to Ike during his time at Fort Sam Houston is him meeting his future wife, Mamie Dowd?
I think it's Mamie Dowd.
Mamie Dowd.
That's how I'm going to say it.
Who is actually a very interesting woman. She comes from a lot of money. And when I say a lot of money, I mean a lot of money.
Yeah.
And she only had an 8th grade education. Her father was a little concerned about her.
Times were a little different back then.
I know, where you could just 8th grade, good enough. So she basically drops out of school in the 8th grade and studies piano and
piano and dance, and then she gets sent to a Miss Wolcott's finishing school for girls, where they learn social graces, but
nothing of any real use.
Yeah, at that point, she learned how to be a socialite, but I feel like at then you're kind of just okay, your quote unquote career goal is to become a housewife, which
a great wife
is fine, but at the same time, the finishing school, she never learned any domestic skills, and growing up wealthy, she never had to do anything for herself. So it kind of became a point of contention later in the marriage that she didn't have any of the quote unquote skills that a wife should have.
Right. And this was a pretty big concern for Mamie's father, who understood that Ike was a military officer, and he didn't see how his daughter could adjust.
He was like, you're gonna go live with a military man
in a barracks.
Right.
So he was concerned about the two getting married, but nonetheless, they start dating in 1915, and they get engaged. Well, they get married in 1916.
Yeah, I believe Ike proposed on Valentine's Day.
Quite the romantic.
Smooth
operator. Good old Ike.
Yeah.
Well, they get married after about a year, and from there, they have a son.
Little Ikey.
9 months later, in 1917.
Yep.
Things moved a little faster back in the early 20th century.
Little Ikey being born kind of came at a time that was sort of considered by Ike to be a low point in his career. He was stationed at Fort Oglethorpe in Georgia. And at the time, there wasn't a whole lot going on there. Fort Oglethorpe was designed to kind of weed out weak officers, and Ike was not a weak officer, and he did what he was supposed to do, but he was not having a whole lot of fun there. Luckily for him, he wasn't there terribly long, and he was sent to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas in December of 1917. He had a lot of fun at Leavenworth. He got to oversee the physical training, the calisthenics, and bayonet drilling for new officers, and he actually got his introduction to tanks at Leavenworth, which would definitely play an impactful role in his career going forward.
And it's important to point out that tanks at this point in time were kind of on the cutting edge of technology.
Oh yeah,
they
weren't working terribly well. They were not smooth machines.
They were not working terribly well, but they had promise.
Yeah, and when I said that he got to take a class at the Army's first tank school, there weren't tanks there.
No tanks.
There were, he was learning about tanks, but not by using them.
Yeah, so learning to shoot, they would just put a large gun on the back of a flatbed truck.
Yeah.
And they would drive around and learn to shoot on the move.
Same thing.
That way. Yeah, pretty similar.
I'm sure.
I mean, what's the difference?
Right. But anyway, in February of 1918, he receives orders to go to Camp Meade in Maryland to join the Tank Corps, which was really exciting for Ike because he wanted nothing more than to get over and see some action in France. And that's what they were slated to do. They were supposed to go to France in June. In his mind, he was like, me and the Tank Corps, we're going to break through the line.
Change the war.
Right. We're going to be the deciding factor.
And it's important to think, this was the war. This was the greatest conflict in human history.
Yeah.
For people who dreamed of being soldiers, to be on the sidelines of this war was almost...
It was shameful.
It was just heartbreaking for them.
Yeah. I mean, for Ike, and this is something we'll touch on when the war ends, the fact that, spoiler alert, he doesn't actually get to go to France, and it's something that really nagged at him, and actually it was detrimental to him.
Kind of follows him throughout his career.
Yeah. And, because in his mind, I'm a professional soldier, and what does a soldier do? He fights in wars. And
how do you explain to people?
He was the war that was supposed to end all wars, and I missed it.
Yeah. How do you explain to people, you remember that big war that everyone fought in?
Yeah.
And I've been a soldier since 1915?
Yeah.
No, I didn't take part.
Yeah, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. So Ike gets sent to Camp Meade, and he was to prepare the 301st Heavy Tank Battalion for combat. Ike did a really good job at Camp Meade, and that was not lost on his superiors. So when the War Department decided to make the Tank Corps an independent branch of the Army, Ike was selected to open the school at Camp Colt, Gettysburg.
Did they have tanks by then?
No, they
Still no tanks.
Still no tanks, but he was to establish that independent tank corps at Gettysburg. And, this was sort of a different assignment for Ike because, and he really enjoyed it. He had a lot of autonomy there because Gettysburg had been shut down for a long time. And so he got to kind of build it from, there was no precedent. The building was all kind of like run down, so he kind of got to rebuild it into the image that he wanted, and also there was no precedent for a tank school, so he got to sort of build the program how he wanted to.
Do it how you want to do it.
And while they were living at Camp Colt, they being Ike and Mamie, they left little Ike with the Dowds in Colorado. There weren't really family barracks or family housing for the officers' wives and stuff, and so they were living in a converted fraternity house, which was large and beautiful, but also pretty much dilapidated. So it wasn't excellent living conditions, and like we mentioned before, Mamie was used to the finer things. Despite all that, they both really liked to entertain, and so their home kind of became like the officers' unofficial hangout. In November of 1918, Ike finally received the orders he'd been waiting for, that he was going to head to France and was going to be part of a giant offensive. But, unfortunately, from Ike's point of view, the armistice was called before he even got over there. And, as we sort of touched on earlier, Ike was completely humiliated. He, in his mind, he had missed out on the greatest war in history. And he really expected that he was going to have to spend the rest of his military career explaining why he didn't go and fight, and he really wasn't wrong. That was one continued problem that his detractors had against him in World War II. Instead of going to France, Ike was charged with dismantling Camp Colt and to facilitate the downsizing of the tank corps, moving them to their permanent home in Camp Meade. But shortly after he had got that underway, the War Department announced a cross-country motorcade that the War Department was funding to more or less demonstrate how poorly the roadways were in the United States. And, I feel like today we take for granted just how easy it is to get from one place to another. But, at the end of World War I, that was completely different.
A lot of dirt roads.
Yeah. Smith, Ike's biographer, really puts a lot of emphasis on the fact that they were broken down all the time, and like they had to stop and build bridges in a lot of places just to get it going. And this was
the average mile per hour was. It was like
so
somewhere
slow.
Between 15 and 30 miles
an
hour.
It was not a quick trip, and it took just a ridiculous amount of time to get from one end of the country to the other. And today you could do it in 2 days?
Yeah, if you're pushing.
Yeah, and I mean I think it took them like 2 weeks. I forget what the actual number of days was, but it was wild. Oh, it took 62 days.
And I bet you they were driving like in shifts. Like
they weren't probably making a whole lot of stops.
Oh god, that'd be horrible.
Yeah, but this definitely stuck with him, and 37 years later, he would sign into law the Interstate Highway Act. When he returned in the fall of 1919 to Camp Meade, he found that the American Expeditionary Force tank corps had come back to Europe, and it was split into two brigades. He was to command the 305th, and a man named George Patton was to command the 304th. Patton and Ike ended up getting along very, very well, although they were very, very different people.
Very different individuals.
Yeah, we've covered Ike's upbringing, and he was definitely from a poor background, even though
somehow like poor with money. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a very strange situation. Definitely, like his family didn't have a lot of money, but they lived in like a very nice home.
Okay, so what I would say is the difference here is like new money and old money.
I don't even know if you can count it as like money, though, is the thing. Like, because to my understanding, Jacob wasn't giving them money, but they lived in a very nice home that was also like self-sustaining in terms of like food and stuff. So I doubt that they had a lot of cash lying around, but they never wanted for the basic necessities.
But let's say compared to most people in, the 19 teens, his family was well off.
Yeah, I mean, they were doing fine.
But the Pattons were on another stratosphere.
Gosh. They were so rich. They were definitely, so Patton hailed from Pasadena, California, and his parents were absolutely members of the elite. Not to take anything away from Patton's
achievements,
intellectual abilities. He was very competent and that sort of thing, but he definitely got into the military academy
based on
how
family connections.
Yeah, based on connection. But like I said, Ike and Patton, though very different people, got along swimmingly.
Yeah, like Ike, he seemed like more of a reserved guy.
Yeah.
Whereas Patton is, if you don't know anything about General Patton, he was very flamboyant.
Yeah, and I definitely think we should cover Patton at some time, but man,
interesting character.
Bad guy. Like, American war hero, absolutely, but bad person.
Listen, he had no time for PTSD.
He had no time for PTSD or people that weren't white, and just not I don't know. Maybe I'm judging him too harshly, but I'll just go out and say it now. Maybe my mind will change when we do the episode, but I'm going to just go ahead and say bad guy.
He's a man of his times. We'll put it that way. He's a man of his times. But the man carried, ivory gripped pistols into battle.
So, Smith does a really great job of juxtaposing the two of them, and throughout his career, Patton traveled with a whole private stable of horses. He always bought the finest cars that money could buy. His uniforms and his civilian clothes were tailored in England, and his boots were imported Italian leather, while Ike drove a Model T, wore standard-issued uniforms, and bought his civilian clothes off the rack. Patton carried 2 custom Colt 45s with ivory grips, and, Ike was a simple guy. He carried that standard issue sidearm.
Yeah, and just to further hammer home this point, and this you can take with a grain of salt because this may just be hearsay, but I'm pretty sure Patton said that he believed himself to be the reincarnation of Scipio Africanus.
I have personally not heard that, but do not doubt it one bit. Not at all. And further juxtaposing the two of them, Ike was an extrovert. He loved to entertain and that sort of stuff. Patton was a loner. He had all these opinions, and he let everyone know about it. He was ultra-conservative and bigoted, openly racist. He did not care if you heard about it. Ike often qualified his statements. He didn't really hold strong convictions about politics or race, which we'll see in his political career. And again, jumping ahead a little bit, but when he comes out and he makes his political ambitions known, both parties are trying to get him because he was just never one of those people who showed strong conviction either way.
So imagine these two guys, and one thing that we learned is that they would go out for these like late night drives and hope that they would be attacked by bandits.
Yeah.
Where these bandits were coming from, I don't know.
Right. Like in Gettysburg, they would just go out in Patton's super rich people cars and just like drive slowly down these roads, hope to be waylaid by highwaymen.
Yeah.
Looking to lay down the law. That's just beautiful. But most importantly, of a juxtaposition between the two of them was that at this time, Patton had made a name for himself in World War I. He was a living legend by this point. And Ike, though, rising through the ranks of the military, was seen as a bright and competent officer, was nowhere near the level of a George Patton. Like everyone fully expected George Patton to be the top of the military within time. All right, so when Ike had gone to Camp Meade after the transcontinental motor march across the country, Mamie had gone with him, and they were living in a small furnished room off base because Camp Meade didn't have any family quarters. Again, having been used to the finer things in life, she only lasted about a month, and she was really annoyed when she left, and their marriage wasn't in a great place when she did. She went back to live with her family with little Ike in Colorado. And she very rarely wrote to Ike or responded to his messages to the point where Ike was corresponding with her parents, trying to get updates on his child and his wife. She did return to Camp Meade in 1920 when the Army finally converted some old barracks into family quarters. The following fall, little Ike came down from Colorado. And, this was really a bright time for Ike, even though he was still really upset about missing the war. He absolutely loved little Ike, and he really wanted a chance to be the father that he never had. And so he played with him all the time, and he took him around the grounds of the camp, and it seemed like they really had just a great relationship. We didn't mention this, but at the time it was not uncommon for wealthy families to sort of give their daughters like a stipend every month. And that is exactly what Mamie had from the Dowds. She was receiving money regularly, and so they had some money coming in besides Ike's earnings. And so they used some of that money to hire a local woman to help out with caring for little Ike and doing household chores, because as we mentioned, Mamie didn't really have domestic skills or have the desire to do domestic-y things. So this woman that they hired. She was great with little Ike, and both of the Eisenhowers liked her a lot. But what they didn't know was that she had previously had scarlet fever, and she didn't have any symptoms at the time. But apparently, she was still carrying the bacteria.
And so, unbeknownst to the Eisenhowers, she ends up communicating this disease to little Ike, and he becomes ill shortly before Christmas, and he's hospitalized, but he eventually holds out for about 10 days. But the disease ends up turning into meningitis. And during this whole time, he's isolated at the hospital, and Ike basically haunts the hallways. He can't really get close to his son, but he can kind of see him and at times talk to him.
But there's no physical contact.
Yeah, no physical contact, and little Ike ends up passing away.
January 2nd.
Yeah, January 2nd. What was the year?
1921.
1921. And the death of little Ike, I would also say, it greatly affected Ike as well as Mamie. But I would say it definitely signaled the death knell for the love, at least, in their marriage.
Yeah, neither Melvin nor I have children, and I can't imagine what a devastating loss it must be for a parent to lose their child. And Smith points out in the book that instead of the two of them like coming together to try to see each other through this like super trying time, they both kind of went about it their own way.
And they kind of they may have blamed each other a little bit for.
Yeah, well, Ike definitely blamed himself. He was the one who hired the woman to help, and although Mamie claimed not to, Smith sort of insinuates that she may have blamed him too.
Nonetheless, it seems that something changed in their marriage following the death of little Ike.
Yeah.
So around the same time, Congress passed the National Defense Act of 1920. Now, this piece of legislation reduced the Army's number from 2.4 million to 288,000. Which
is pretty drastic.
That's a major reduction in strength. And subsequent legislation actually reduced it to even less than 150,000 in 1922. So this act abolished the Tank Corps, and it returned it to the infantry. So when the Tank Corps was abolished, Patton decides to return to the cavalry as an executive officer. But before he left Camp Meade, he and his wife hosted a Sunday dinner party for Brigadier General Fox Connor, to which Ike and Mamie were invited. Now, Connor was, a very influential person in terms of Ike's career. So him meeting Fox Connor actually became a turning point in Ike's career.
Connor was also a really brilliant strategist and military thinker. He was a real student of military history, and he greatly affected the way Ike thought about military strategy.
So in the early 1920s, Fox gets called up to lead the 20th Infantry Brigade in the Panama Canal Zone. And to help him out with this, he taps Ike and brings him on board as an executive officer.
Yeah, because at that meeting that we had just talked about that Patton had sort of set up, the whole idea behind it was for Patton to introduce Ike to Connor. And the three of them got to know each other, got to talk to each other about strategy and what Patton and Ike thought about the future of tank warfare. We didn't mention this before, but the two of them were definitely in a minority of people who thought that tanks were the future of military warfare. Most people thought that they were just sort of a flash in the pan and that they were a tool, but they wouldn't be the defining piece of technology. Connor was very open to their ideas, and so the three of them talked about that, and he was very impressed with Ike.
Yeah, so when Ike gets down to Panama, not really a whole lot happens. He handles himself very well, and he actually finds himself attending the Command and General Staff College.
Yeah, we should say, too, that this next period in Ike's career, not super exciting, but definitely influential for his career development, because he got to learn at the feet of some really brilliant generals.
That said, Mamie was with Ike in Panama, and she, absolutely hated just about every moment there.
Yeah, and, their marriage was still sort of in a rocky place following the death of little Ike.
Yeah, but this didn't stop them from having another child, their second son, John. But Mamie actually leaves Panama, goes back to Denver in order to give birth to their son,
John Sheldon Dowd Eisenhower, born on August 3rd, 1922.
Meanwhile, Ike finds himself returning to the United States, and ends up at this Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where he actually does really well. He finishes first in his class. But while he's there, he kind of runs afoul of someone in a high place at this college.
Yeah, because he was being pulled in a couple of different directions. After he finished up at Leavenworth, the adjutant general wanted to send him to a major university as professor of military sciences and tactics and to head up the ROTC program there. He was also going to, again, coach the university's football team, which, I might add, was going to come with a separate pension. So Ike was going to be making some dough. The chief of the infantry, however, thought that Ike needed more time commanding troops, and he ended up being the one who prevailed. He sort of had a grudge against Ike because Connor had sort of tapped Ike early to go to Leavenworth. I guess this was earlier in traditional career trajectory for officers.
Yeah, so he gets tapped to go to Fort Benning to command the 24th Infantry, which is an all-black division. So this was seen as a punitive assignment.
Yeah, because at the time, remember, the Army was still segregated. So he was the white commander of an all-black regiment, which was not seen as a high commission.
Not to mention, American society is still segregated. I mean, he's taking over, commanding these troops in the South, and not to mention the Jim Crow South, where the kind of living conditions for African Americans are pretty. The only way we can put it in today's terms, just frightening. You can't vote. You can't sit at the same lunch counter. You certainly can't date or marry people of another race. And all of this is kind of codified, not only legally, but also kind of in the social fabric of life in the South. So this was a very
this was a major obstacle for Ike's career.
Yeah. I mean, he could have certainly found himself lavaging, kind of just wasting away there in terms of his career.
Yeah, and so for the third time, Fox Connor rides to Ike's rescue and pulls some strings to get Ike assigned to the Battle Monuments Commission that was sort of a cushy position that was made for General of the Armies, John J. Pershing. The purpose of the Battle Monuments Commission was to document U.S. participation in World War I, and Ike's job was to serve as a historian. He was known as a good writer, a fan of history, and someone who was capable of doing the necessary research to sort of create a narrative account of the United States in World War I. So he ended up producing a guide to the American battlefields in Europe, which is still considered an excellent reference to the American effort in World War I. More importantly, though, he got a really good understanding of Pershing's tactics and the way that the Americans had fought that war and the geography of France. Shortly before Ike's time with the Battle Monuments Commission ended, he was made aware that he had been selected to attend the Army War College. By all accounts, Ike was a very competent officer and deserved to go to the War College, but this too had Connor's fingerprints all over it. And this was a big thing going to the Army War College, because unlike the Command and General Staff school that Ike had previously attended, which sort of prepares officers to serve on general staff, the Army War College grooms future generals. It teaches its students how war worked, how armies were mobilized, how they were supplied and deployed, how relationships with allies worked, and grand strategy. When Ike's time with Pershing ended in August of 1927, he wrote Ike a glowing commendation to the chief of the infantry. And this letter really represents a watershed moment in Ike's career. Up to this point, he'd been seen as a gifted protege of Fox Connor, but Pershing's words really catapulted Ike's career trajectory. His rise to the top wasn't a guarantee, but from that point forward, he'd be given assignments based on his abilities. And if he failed to perform, he was finished. But if he excelled, more or less his potential was limitless. He did really well at the War College. His only real assignment was to produce an original research paper. He wrote about the United States' lack of readiness for the outbreak of another war. He wrote quite a bit about his experience traveling cross-country and how mobilization would be slow. When his time at the War College ended, he was recommissioned to the Battle Monuments Commission because Pershing decided that he wanted to redo the whole guidebook that Ike had written.
Jesus.
Yeah, and this time he wanted to do it in France. So Ike may have been frustrated about having to redo all of his work, but he was pumped to get to go to France. Finally, he still hadn't been there. He was going to get a firsthand look at the battlefields, And this was really important for him. He and Mamie got to travel together, and they both loved Paris.
Yeah, it seemed to actually work out pretty well for them.
Yeah, and Smith sort of talks about this period in their marriage as probably the high point, because they got to live like rich folks, which Mamie, I'm sure, appreciated as much as Ike did. They benefited from a really favorable exchange rate. Plus, by this point, Ike was making a pretty decent salary from the army. So he and Mamie are living the good life over in
Paris.
France. Yeah. But, all good things must come to an end. And he rewrites the whole book that he had written before again, gets to see France and become acquainted with the geography, and really gets that firsthand knowledge of how the war was fought. From 1929 to 1933, Ike served as the executive officer to Assistant Secretary of War, General V. Mosley. This was in D.C., where he and Mamie set up in a beautiful apartment where they hosted their friends all the time. Again, still living a great life. Their marriage seems to be doing pretty well. When his time under Mosley comes to an end, Ike became General Douglas MacArthur's chief military aide. And in 1935, he accompanies MacArthur to the Philippines. MacArthur had been appointed the military advisor to the Philippine government, and Ike his assistant. This post came with gigantic stipends from the Philippine government on top of their already pretty large military salaries. In fact, the two of them with this post became the two highest paid officers in the military, with MacArthur's monthly stipend from the government being close to $40,000 in today's money, and Ike's close to $14,000.
Can you imagine what they were living like in 1930s?
Yeah, well, I know this was the case for MacArthur, and I think it was the case for Ike too, but they were both put up rent-free in like this more or less like resort in the Philippines. So that money was more or less just theirs to do with what they pleased.
My God, I would stack so much money.
Oh yeah. But Mamie had no interest in leaving DC. She was set up, she had friends, now Ike rising through the ranks, she had
status.
She had some clout. The way Smith describes it among military wives at the time was very tied to your husband's rank. And because Ike was climbing the ranks, so was she on the social ladder among military wives.
But
what
about Ike in the Philippines?
So, Ike, he was schmoozing. He was rubbing elbows. This post for MacArthur was really just sort of like a favor to Douglas MacArthur, who was a hero of World War I. So he gets over there to get paid, and he just takes it easy. He's like,
let's the subordinates do
he's
their
like,
jobs.
This is my tropical island. My subordinates can't handle this, and that's exactly what Ike does. He steps up and he schmoozes with the president. He schmoozes with the Philippine elite. He schmoozes with one of his fellow military man's wife, Marion Huff, who was the wife of Lieutenant Sidney Huff, who was MacArthur's naval aide. And there were a lot of rumors around their relationship that, he and Marion were more than friends.
A little closer than friends.
Yeah. And there's no way to be sure, but Ike was away from Mamie, so you can understand why some of these rumors came about.
And needless to say, his relationship with not only Mamie kind of soured, but his relationship with MacArthur soured during this time a little bit too, right?
Yeah, and another thing about the whole situation, Ike really resented Mamie for not coming with him.
Yeah.
And he really resented the lifestyle she was leading in D.C., which was, still having all these parties, attending these parties, which came with having male escorts, but not necessarily in a romantic way. It was just sort of a product of the times that, like, you went out and you had an escort.
How dare she?
Right. Like, how dare you have a life, woman? For whatever reason, Ike just didn't trust Mamie's fidelity, and that might have led to why he was running around with Marion Huff, or he just might not, it might have just been a giant double standard for Ike.
Yeah, could have been.
But it certainly seems that Ike was being a little less than loyal, and he was holding Mamie to a double standard. She eventually realized that she was sort of losing Ike, and that if she were going to be Ike's wife, she was going to have to go to the Philippines.
Can't lose that status.
Yeah, seriously. And so she did. She came out to the Philippines to join Ike, and Ike meets her at the dock that she sailed in on, and apparently was quoted as saying, "I gather I have reason for divorce if I want one," and pretty much didn't talk to her for the rest of the day. So it was like
rough.
Right. Warm greetings after having not seen each other for a long time. But, at this point, Mamie sort of came to the realization that with Ike going forward, it was going to be his way or the highway, and she chose his way. As you said, Ike's relationship with MacArthur also soured. We kind of talked about how MacArthur had just been living the high life while his subordinates, especially Ike, kind of did the job that he was supposedly there to do, which was advise the military and the government.
And Ike did this job pretty well.
Real well. And he was really
close.
well liked. The president of the Philippines at the time, I'm probably going to butcher his name, but I think it was Quezon, President Quezon, I think. But they had a really great relationship. They hung out a lot. They played cards and that sort of stuff. And they had a great relationship. And I believe it was members of the Filipino Congress prepared a bill that, if passed, would have eliminated MacArthur's position. And
basically, why did they need MacArthur?
Right. And they were paying him a ton of money.
Yeah.
$40,000 a month in today's money. But like, still, that's a lot of money.
A lot.
Right. For a guy who's not doing anything.
And we like Ike. Why don't we just pay Ike?
Who's already doing the job? Ike had no idea that this was in the works. And when he found out, he was
mortified
because the last thing he wanted to be seen as was an ambitious subordinate trying to jump over MacArthur. But that's exactly what happened.
And word on the street is people are whispering in MacArthur's ear saying, hey, that Ike guy is trying to take your spot. Better be careful.
Well, as soon as he caught wind of it, he went to the Congress and was like, listen, if you even introduce this bill, I'm out. Like, I'm leaving. I don't care if it passes or what. I'm leaving immediately. But he tried to keep it from MacArthur, but damage was already done. MacArthur heard about it, and he just was more or less done with Ike at that point. He reduced Ike to operations officer and stripped him of any responsibility that would put him in any contact with the Filipino government. And Ike, was not happy, and he started his maneuvering to get out of Manila. In May of 1939, he received his orders that assigned him to the 15th Infantry at Fort Lewis. And, last-ditch effort, President Quezon begged Ike to stay. And he said, listen, I had a blank check for you. Just stay here. But Ike was not about that, and he just wanted to get as far away from MacArthur as he possibly could. So Ike arrived at Fort Lewis, Washington in December of 1939. In March of 1941, he was promoted to colonel and assigned as the chief of staff under Major General Kenyon Joyce. That June, he was made chief of staff to General Walter Kruger, commander of the 3rd Army at Fort Sam Houston. And then after that, he participated in the Louisiana maneuvers, which were like these gigantic war games, sort of designed to see how prepared the Army was to fight another war. He did well, and he was promoted to Brigadier General on October 3rd, 1941.
So, yeah, all of these moves happened shortly after MacArthur gets out of the Philippines, which is a good deal. I'm sorry, not MacArthur, but Ike gets out of the Philippines, which is a good deal because rather than, getting thrown out by the Japanese, which MacArthur did, Ike kind of got to leave on his own terms.
Yeah, and I think that's a good stopping point for us here for this episode. We're going to pick up with World War II when we get back.
So this has been the Life of X podcast. We'll see you next time.
Hey guys, just a quick message before you take off. Please remember to subscribe, leave us a 5-star rating and review wherever you're listening to this podcast right now. It really helps get the word out about Life of X. Don't forget to tell a friend. And if you're interested in supporting the show in any other way, please head over to the lifeofxpodcast.com and click on our support page. Thank you.